Hi everyone, this is DJTyrant with Blizzplanet here at the Mists of Pandaria Launch Event with Ian Hazzikostas, and you're the lead encounter?
Yes, lead encounter designer on World of Warcraft.
Okay. And so we're here celebrating the launch of Mists of Pandaria and going to ask Ian a couple questions about Mists of Pandaria and specifically raiding and encounters.
Sounds good.
First up, what will set Mists of Pandaria encounters apart from Cataclysm encounters?
I mean, for starters, just the sheer breadth of content. We have so much variety. I think there's more endgame content in Mists of Pandaria than in any of our prior expansions, and that theme is continued through with the raid and dungeon content in particular. We have 18 raid bosses in the 5.0 patch at release, including 2 world bosses in the Outer World, and then 16 bosses spread across 3 instances.
So you mentioned the world bosses. How is that going to be different from what we saw in Vanilla and also Burning Crusade?
Probably a bit closer to the vanilla experience in some cases. So there's 2 outdoor world bosses. There's the Shah of Anger, and then Salius's warband riding the giant Mushan beast known as Galleon. The Shah of Anger is not going to be quite as competitive. It's a bit more like a replacement for Archivon or Barret and Hold in terms of the loot delivery mechanism there. Shah of Anger is a manifestation of negative emotion of anger that spawns and towers over the Kunlai Summit Zone. Players who are leveling out there, tomorrow in the zone will see this big bad raid boss in the distance. As they're doing their quests, we'll have to avoid him. And he respawns every 2 hours and drops a giant grab bag of both PvE and PvP loot. Again, very much like Archivon or Tolbarad bosses. And you can only loot him once a week, but he respawns every 2 hours. So
everyone should get a chance.
There'll be some conflict, but if there's a huge group there camping him that'll kill you if you get close to the PvP server, you can come back later.
About the first month or so, it seems like it'll be a pretty good competition for it.
Whereas Salius's warband, Galleon, who spawns in the Valley of the Four Winds zone, that is a giant Mushan beast. Mushan is kind of a lizard-like Kodo-style creature that is only found in Pandaria, and it's so large, it's basically the size of a small village. It has a whole band, a war band of Sorok lizardmen riding on its back, and has large mounted cannons that it's using to kind of bombard the peaceful villages in the zone. That only spawns once or twice a week, and it drops unique loot that you can't get anywhere else, and that we expect to be very much like a Khazak Azurago style experience, particularly on PvP servers. Cool. You'll see that the boss is up, try to get your friends together as quickly as possible to get the tap, get the kill, and on PvP servers, fight off anyone else who wants to get a piece of the boss.
Yeah, definitely. Well, reflecting back on Cataclysm a bit, what do you feel you guys can take away as designs that worked and maybe some designs that you could learn something from?
Okay, so I think something that, for starters, I guess a major learning experience for us, I think, was the player reaction to the Cataclysm Heroic Dungeons at release in 4.0. And those were very polarizing. On the one hand, we heard from a lot of our sort of hardcore raiders, guild players that went in with their friends, like, this is the most fun I've had in years, these dungeons are amazing, change nothing. Great job, Blizzard, bravo. And on the other end of the spectrum, from players who were doing it through looking for dungeon with random match-made groups, they had a very frustrating experience. And the latter group outnumbers the former at this point.
Definitely.
And so, some of that was the product of the introduction of looking for dungeon mode as, we were in the process of making Cataclysm content. That was introduced in 3.3, and at the time was for old dungeons that had already been outgeared and that everyone was familiar with. It was a much easier format to adapt to, versus asking players doing LFD to learn new challenging mechanics for the very first time. And that was something where that experience just didn't work out so well. Many players were frustrated as a result, and that's something that we've learned. The Mists of Pandaria dungeons are tuned really for the LFD audience, and players who are going in there who were frustrated in Cataclysm should have a much better experience this coming week. However, for the gilded players, for the groups of friends that want a good, real challenge when they do their dungeons, that's what challenge modes are for. Once you've geared up, which will happen rather quickly, and you're running the dungeons for Valor points, challenge modes offer a more efficient, faster way of getting Valor points, such that you should do the dungeon with your friends, with your guildmates, but it's also really going to go back to that traditional WoW MMO experience of running a dungeon with your friends, where you need to use crowd control, you need to have a target order, the tank needs to keep ads off the healer, you need to really be communicating, and content is really designed to demand that. It's a throwback to some of the Burning Crusade heroics in terms of the audience and the tuning. So really we're trying to offer an experience that is accessible and is tuned for everybody.
Okay. And kind of going on that, with how quickly most players tear through the content, what are you going to do this time around to keep the hardcore raiding populace of WoW kind of involved and engaged in WoW still?
Well, For starters, having 16 raid bosses doesn't hurt.
Yeah.
There's a lot of bosses to work through. I mean, one of the things that we heard from players in Tier 11, actually, which only had 12 bosses, or 13 if you count Sinestra as heroic only, was that there was almost too much content. You know, they were raiding hardcore week after week to get through all of it. And they were like, wow, this was great content, but also could have maybe used a little bit of a breather in the middle. So one of the things that we're doing this time around is actually breaking up that content. The first raid zone is going to open up next week, the Mogushan Vaults, with 6 raid bosses. But then Heart of Fear and Terrace of Endless Spring will be accessible later in October with the remaining 10 bosses at a higher tier of difficulty, higher tier of gear, and also expecting that you've had a chance to gear up a bit in Mogushan Vaults. Mm-hmm. So working through what is 16 heroic modes, I think is going to take even our hardcore raiders quite a while. At the same time, we recognize that, you know, we owe it to our players to deliver more content and faster. And that's something that we're continually working on as a team. And, you know, we don't like the long delay, the number of months players had to, you know, just raid Dragon Soul, for example. And that's something we're really committed to minimizing as much as possible going forward.
Kind of along the lines of progression in raids, will the item progression remain the same to how we've seen with expansion heroics leading into raids, or will there be a stopgap solution similar to 4.3 where we had the Dragon Soul heroics, which offered higher level gear than a lot of the raids, just to get people into Dragon Soul for that end of expansion raid boss?
Going forward, I think it remains to be seen. I mean, certainly the experience for players just leveling up now and hitting 90 will be a very familiar one. You hit max level, you start doing dungeons, you get your reputations up, you get things from rep vendors, kind of assemble your set to get ready to raid, and then you go into the raids and do that. However, you know, obviously you can also do scenarios for gear. But one of the things that I think in retrospect maybe wasn't a pure positive that I don't think we need to repeat about the way the Dragon Soul heroics worked was that they did to an extent invalidate the accomplishments of people who had raided extensively and played a lot in the 4.2 patch. That because Dragon Soul heroics gave eye level 372 gear compared to the 379 that you got from Firelands, someone could have the experience that, you know, their buddy who returned to the game and just did a lot of Firelands over one weekend was basically equally geared as their character that had raided all the way through Firelands. And catch-up mechanisms are important, but there's always a fine line between making, you know, the new content accessible to players and invalidating the accomplishments of those who come before. I think one of the things that we have now as a result of the looking for raid system is the ability to say that, you know, actually you can progress through LFR. And it's completely reasonable, I think, for the experience to be in the 5.1, 5.2 patch going forward when we introduce new raid content, for someone to go back and run the existing Looking for Raid dungeons. Maybe you run Looking for Raid Mogushan Vaults, you run Looking for Raid Heart of Fear, and that prepares you for whatever the next raid is.
Alright. Kind of going back to, we talked about difficulty and stuff in Cataclysm, with what is the difficulty going to be for the opening raids for Mists of Pandaria? Cata saw a really pretty steep learning curve, I think. I personally liked it. A lot of people I know didn't necessarily care for it.
I think, you know...
it seems like you guys stepped away from that with Firelands and definitely with Dragon Soul and implementing Looking for Raid stuff. How is it going to compare? How are the opening raids going to compare to how Cataclysm opened up?
I think the introduction might be a little bit more accessible, but for the most part, I think it generally compares more to Tier 11 than to Firelands, let's say. I think Looking for Raid mode really lets us target our audiences for different types of content more effectively. In Firelands, you had a boss like Shanox that was, for example, definitely designed to be something that pickup groups could do. You could go in, clear trash, hoping for epics, and then you'd spawn this guy that patrolled around, and you could pull him and win. That's because we wanted to have an outlet for more casual groups or pickup groups to actually raid successfully. Whereas now Looking for Raid mode exists for precisely that audience. So the normal content really is designed for guilds. It's designed for groups of friends and guilds that play together on a regular basis, and pugs and more casual players have Looking for Raid as a way of seeing the content and advancing their characters through that
definitely.
mode.
When you go to create an encounter in a dungeon or raid, what are some of the guidelines for creating one? And to follow up on that, how do you test out the design before implementing it into the game itself?
So, I mean, the process overall, I don't know if there's like specific guidelines. It's more a matter, it begins with sort of the creative storytelling aspect of it, of sort of what is the boss, right? What is the instance is step one. And then what are the other bosses and creatures that populate this instance? Okay, Firelands, this is the piece of the elemental plane of fire, ruled over by Ragnaros, the elemental lord of fire. Well, okay, what else goes in the zone? And a lot of that is just, you know, we have a lot of brainstorming meetings with the other encounter designers, with quest designers, with artists, that boil down to, in many cases, just what would be really cool. So a giant firehawk that bursts out of a volcano, that's really cool. Okay, let's put that in the zone. A giant spider that spins webs made of pure magma and has this canopy of magma webs draped over a forest. That's cool, let's make it. And so that's the first step. Then the next step is actually coming up with the mechanics. And so we brainstorm and sort of go back and forth. People throw out different ideas. We see what we like. And it's very much a group collaborative process. From that point, the boss is assigned to an individual designer to take kind of the collective creativity and brainstorming and refine that into an actual implementation in the game. And so before it's actually implemented in the game, I guess, really that group process serves to refine the mechanics of the encounter. Mm-hmm. People throw out what they see as maybe pitfalls or things that might not sound fun or things that might be really hard to tune or hard to implement and so forth. So those get weeded out and refined, and then it's implemented for internal testing. We do a lot of internal play testing. We have obviously quality assurance teams that go through, find bugs. Mm-hmm. We also play test it ourselves, and long before anyone ever sees the encounter on beta or PTR, we've played through it many times. And then, of course, our player base sees it, and then it goes out to the live servers.
Going back to kind of the dungeons in this expansion, I know you guys have expanded a lot on those, and it looks really exciting. When creating the encounters for these dungeons, how much is consideration is made for the challenge modes now, or the challenge modes times based on the encounters? So which kind of determines which, basically?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. The dungeons this time around were not designed necessarily with challenge mode in mind. They were designed and then sort of upgraded, and the difficulty was increased, because we were kind of, over the course of Mists' testing, we were kind of refining and debating and coming up with exactly what our challenge mode philosophy was going to be, how they were going to work, what the sort of rule sets were going to be. So we didn't necessarily know exactly what the final product was going to be until we got there. Mm-hmm. In many cases, the encounters themselves are extremely complex, and just tuning up the mechanics to be really unforgiving makes for that type of really coordination-intensive environment that we're trying to create. In other cases, however, challenge modes introduce brand new creatures, there are additional patrols present. Bosses in some cases have all new spells or new mechanics on challenge mode only.
So similar to Heroics and Burning Crusade in a way, because they had some additional mechanics.
In some cases, yes. Okay. In some cases, it's enough to just crank up the numbers. In other cases, we need to add something more. But our goal was to deliver an experience that really requires coordination and skillful play.
Okay. How involved is your team in the new scenario system? Are you guys really involved with that? Okay.
Involved to an extent.
Okay.
I think the scenarios are something that really the entire design team of World of Warcraft contributes to. So whether the quest designers, system designers, there are a couple of designers that work primarily on scenarios. Everyone contributes to the system in their own way. The scenarios themselves have a great variety and diversity. They reflect different design philosophies, and they're different experiences. Some of them are very serious, and you're playing through very important momentous events in Warcraft history. In other ones, you're helping brew beer, and that's cool. So yes, I mean, my team in general, while we focus on raid and dungeon content, we're also, I think you could say, kind of like specialists in multiplayer PvE combat. So sometimes we'll help with the outdoor ability design for major quest bosses or scenario bosses, things like that.
So what challenges has Scenarios brought into your designs? I know you guys just released Theramore, and that had a pretty mixed reception, I would say. What have you learned from, it's only been like a week.
Sure.
What have you guys learned in this week so far?
Okay, almost two separate questions there.
Yeah, it was two separate questions.
Theramore in particular, I think, there were a lot of issues. We've heard a lot of feedback from our players. I think one of the major issues with Theramore as released was we heard from many players they really would prefer more backstory and more context into what they're doing there. And on the one hand, when we designed this scenario, we designed it as level 90 replayable content. And something that we've learned and heard from players on the other end of the spectrum is that when you're playing something multiple times to gear up or to get Valor points or what have you, they don't necessarily want long exposition that they have to wade through or skip through. The Brand Bronzebeard cutscenes, for example, in Halls of Stone were not some of the most fondly recalled moments in WoW Dungeons. But for a launch event context, for players who are trying to understand the events that have actually happened here leading up to the fall of Theramore, we could have done more, I think, to deliver on that story and that expectation. And then other challenges with the scenario themselves, it's really just been about figuring out what the gameplay was going to be like. The main thing that sets scenarios apart is, aside from being free players, there are no role requirements. It's role agnostic. You can go in there with 3 damage dealers, 2 damage dealers, and a healer. You don't have the standard gameplay of a tank holding things in place while a healer keeps the tank up and the DPS chips away. And so, designing combat for that type of setting, it's just a different experience for us. And clearly there are pitfalls, clearly there are mistakes made along the way, but we learn from our mistakes. We pay very close attention to community feedback, and we're hard at work adding new scenarios, updating and polishing the existing ones for future patches, and so we're constantly listening to what the feedback our players have is.
Cool. So let's end on this one. What's your favorite encounter so far that you've created in Mists of Pandaria? And kind of a follow-up to that, are there any tricks up your guys' sleeves for encounters we might see in the first patch, the 5.1?
Okay. Again, really hard to pick just a single encounter. I mean,
I know, it's like picking a favorite child.
Yeah, exactly. My team has made some amazing encounters this time around. Just, I guess, to call out one that players are going to be seeing next week when the Mogushan Vaults open, I'd have to say the Spirit Kings encounter. It's the 4th encounter in the zone, and players fight a series of 4 ancient Mogu kings, sort of reincarnated and taken form as spirits. And it evokes some of the best elements of the Omnitron Defense Council encounter in Blackwing Descent, where the order that they come out can vary, and depending on the order which they activate, you have different interactions and abilities that players have to really respond to on the fly. There are a lot of very cool visuals, but it's a very dynamic encounter that really keeps you on your toes from start to finish, and I think players are going to have a great time with it.
All right.
And then there was another question, I think, built into that I
what tricks do you have up your sleeve for 5.1?
Okay. Sure, just to throw out, 5.1 or 5.0?
Your next, the next major patch.
Clearly we're going to have, clearly we're going to be releasing more raid content in the future. Obviously we're focusing on what is being released now, what players are going to be experiencing next week and thereafter. One thing I can say is we definitely heard from our players that they're really excited about and they like large raid tiers, right? Players fondly recall things like Ulduar, Ice Crown Citadel, and we've heard that we like large raid tiers too, and we're committed to really delivering more content than ever before, keeping our high level of quality and trying to get it into players' hands as frequently as possible.
All right. Well, this has been Ian and DJTyrant from Blizzplanet. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Looking forward to the new content.
Likewise.
Thanks.